random and publicly expressed. First section containing the preliminary articles of perpetual peace between states. No treaty of peace shall be regarded as valid, if made with the secret reservation of material for a future war. For then it would be a mere truce, a mere suspension of hostilities, not peace. A peace signifies the end of all hostilities, and to attach to it the epithet eternal is not only a verbal pleonasm, but matter of suspicion. The causes of a future war existing, although perhaps not yet known to the high contracting parties themselves, are entirely annihilated by the conclusion of peace, however acutely they may be ferreted out of documents in the public archives. There may be a mental reservation of old claims to be thought out at a future time, which are, none of them, mentioned at this stage, because both parties are too much exhausted to continue the war, while the evil intention remains of using the first favorable opportunity for further hostilities. Diplomacy of this kind only Jesuitical casuistry can justify. It is beneath the dignity of a ruler, just as acquiescence in such processes of reasoning is beneath the dignity of his minister, if one judges the facts as they really are. 109. If, however, according to present enlightened ideas of political wisdom, the true glory of a state lies in the uninterrupted development of its power by every possible means, this judgment must certainly strike one as scholastic and pedantic. No state having an independent existence, whether it be great or small, shall be acquired by another through inheritance, exchange, purchase or donation. ILO** for a state is not a property, patrimonium, as may be the ground on which its people are settled. It is a society of human beings over whom no one but itself has the right to rule and to dispose. Like the trunk of a tree, it has its own roots, and to graft it onto another state is to do away with its existence as a moral person, and to make of it a thing. Hence it is in contradiction to the idea of the original contract, without which no right over a people is thinkable. 111. Everyone knows to what danger the bias in favor of these modes of acquisition has brought Europe. In other parts of the world, it has never been known. The custom of marriage between states, as if they were individuals, has survived even up to the most recent times. 112 and is regarded partly as a new kind of industry by which ascendancy may be acquired through family alliances, without any expenditure of strength. Partly as a device for territorial expansion. Moreover, the hiring out of the troops of one state to another to fight against an enemy not at war with their native country is to be reckoned in this connection, for the subjects are in this way used and abused at will as personal property. Standing armies, miles perpetuos, shall be abolished in course of time, for they are always threatening other states with war by appearing to be in constant readiness to fight. They incite the various states to outrival one another in the number of their soldiers, and to this number no limit can be set. Now, since owing to the sums devoted to this purpose, peace at last becomes even more oppressive than a short war, these standing armies are themselves the cause of wars of aggression, undertaken in order to get rid of this burden. To which we must add that the practice of hiring men to kill or to be killed seems to imply a use of them as mere machines and instruments in the hand of another, namely, the state, which cannot easily be reconciled with the right of humanity in our own person. 113 The matter stands quite differently in the case of voluntary periodical military exercise on the part of citizens of the state, who thereby seek to secure themselves and their country against attack from without. The accumulation of treasure in a state would in the same way be regarded by other states as a menace of war, and might compel them to anticipate this by striking the first blow. For of the three forces, the power of arms, the power of alliance and the power of money, the last might well become the most reliable instrument of war, did not the difficulty of ascertaining the amount stand in the way. No national debts shall be contracted in connection with the external affairs of the state. This source of help is above suspicion, where assistance is sought outside or within the state, on behalf of the economic administration of the country, for instance, the improvement of the roads, the settlement and support of new colonies, the establishment of granaries to provide against seasons of scarcity, and so on. But, as a common weapon used by the powers against one another, a credit system under which debts go on indefinitely increasing and are yet always assured against immediate claims, because all the creditors do not put in their claim at once, is a dangerous money power. This ingenious invention of a commercial people in the present century is, in other words, a treasure for the carrying on of war which may exceed the treasures of all the other states taken together, and can only be exhausted by a threatening deficiency in the taxes, an event, however, which will long be kept off by the very briskness of commerce resulting from the reaction of this system on industry and trade. The ease, then, with which war may be waged, coupled with the inclination of rulers towards it, an inclination which seems to be implanted in human nature, is a great obstacle in the way of perpetual peace. The prohibition of this system must be laid down as a preliminary article of perpetual peace, all the more necessarily because the final inevitable bankruptcy of the state in question must involve in the loss many who are innocent, and this would be a public injury to these states. Therefore other nations are at least justified in uniting themselves against such an one and its pretensions. No state shall violently interfere with the constitution and administration of another. For what can justify it in so doing? The scandal which is here presented to the subjects of another state. The erring state can much more serve as a warning by exemplifying the great evils which a nation draws down on itself through its own lawlessness. Moreover, the bad example which one free person gives another, as scandalum acceptum, does no injury to the latter. In this connection, it is true, we cannot count the case of a state which has become split up through internal corruption into two parts, each of them representing by itself an individual state which lays claim to the whole. Here the yielding of assistance to one faction could not be reckoned as interference on the part of a foreign state with the constitution of another, for here anarchy prevails. So long, however, as the inner strife has not yet reached this stage, the interference of other powers would be a violation of the rights of an independent nation which is only struggling with internal disease. 114 It would therefore itself cause a scandal, and make the autonomy of all states insecure. No state at war with another shall countenance such modes of hostility as would make mutual confidence impossible in a subsequent state of peace. Such are the employment of assassins, percussors, or of poisoners, venefici, breaches of capitulation, the instigating and making use of treachery, pedulio, in the hostile state. These are dishonorable stratagems. For some kind of confidence in the disposition of the enemy must exist even in the midst of war, as otherwise peace could not be concluded, and the hostilities would pass into a war of extermination, bellum internicinum. War, however, is only our wretched expedient of asserting a right by force, an expedient adopted in the state of nature, where no court of justice exists which could settle the matter in dispute. In circumstances like these, neither of the two parties can be called an unjust enemy, because this form of speech presupposes a legal decision, the issue of the conflict, just as in the case of the so-called judgments of God decides on which side right is. Between states, however, no punitive war, bellum punitivum, is thinkable, because between them a relation of superior and inferior does not exist. Whence it follows that a war of extermination, where the process of annihilation would strike both parties at once and all right as well, would bring about perpetual peace only in the great graveyard of the human race. Such a war then, and therefore also the use of all means which lead to it, must be absolutely forbidden. That the methods just mentioned do inevitably lead to this result is obvious from the fact that these infernal arts, already vile in themselves, on coming into use, are not long confined to the sphere of war. Take, for example, the use of spies, ut exploratoribus. Here only the dishonesty of others is made use of. But vices such as these, when once encouraged, cannot in the nature of things be stamped out and would be carried over into the state of peace, where their presence would be utterly destructive to the purpose of that state. Although the laws stated are, objectively regarded, i.e. in so far as they affect the action of rulers, purely prohibitive laws, liges prohibitive, some of them, liges strict, are strictly valid without regard to circumstances and urgently require to be enforced. Such are nos. 1, 5, 6. Others, again, although not indeed exceptions to the maxims of law, yet in respect of the practical application of these maxims allow subjectively of a certain latitude to suit particular circumstances. The enforcement of these liges may be legitimately put off, so long as we do not lose sight of the ends at which they aim. This purpose of reform does not permit of the deferment of an act of restitution to an infinitely distant date, as Augustus used to say, to the Greek calends, a day that will never come. This would be to sanction non-restitution. Delay is permitted only with the intention that restitution should not be made too precipitately and so defeat the purpose we have in view. For the prohibition refers here only to the mode of acquisition which is to be no longer valid, and not to the fact of possession which, although indeed it has not the necessary title of right, yet at the time of so-called acquisition was held legal by all states, in accordance with the public opinion of the time. 115*. Second section containing the definitive articles of a perpetual peace between states. A state of peace among men who live side by side is not the natural state, status naturalis, which is rather to be described as a state of war. 116*. That is to say, although there is not perhaps always actual open hostility, yet there is a constant threatening that an outbreak may occur. Thus the state of peace must be established. 117 For the mere cessation of hostilities is no guarantee of continued peaceful relations, and unless this guarantee is given by every individual to his neighbor, which can only be done in a state of society regulated by law, one man is at liberty to challenge another and treat him as an enemy. 118*. First definitive article of perpetual peace: the civil constitution of each state shall be republican. The only constitution which has its origin in the idea of the original contract, upon which the lawful legislation of every nation must be based, is the republican. 119. It is a constitution, in the first place, founded in accordance with the principle of the freedom of the members of society as human beings, secondly, in accordance with the principle of the dependence of all, as subjects, on a common legislation, and, thirdly, in accordance with the law of the equality of the members as citizens. It is then, looking at the question of right, the only constitution whose fundamental principles lie at the basis of every form of civil constitution. And the only question for us now is, whether it is also the one constitution which can lead to perpetual peace. Now the Republican Constitution, apart from the soundness of its origin, since it arose from the pure source of the concept of right, has also the prospect of attaining the desired result, namely, perpetual peace. And the reason is this. If, as must be so under this Constitution, the consent of the subjects is required to determine whether there shall be war or not, nothing is more natural than that they should weigh the matter well, before undertaking such a bad business. For in decreeing war, they would of necessity be resolving to bring down the miseries of war upon their country. This implies, they must fight themselves, they must hand over the costs of the war out of their own property. They must do their poor best to make good the devastation which it leaves behind. And finally, as a crowning ill, they have to accept a burden of debt which will embitter even peace itself, and which they can never pay off on account of the new wars which are always impending. On the other hand, in a government where the subject is not a citizen holding a vote, i.e. a constitution which is not republican, the plunging into war is the least serious thing in the world. For the ruler is not a citizen, but the owner of the state, and does not lose a whit by the war, while he goes on enjoying the delights of his table or sport, or of his pleasure palaces and gala days. He can therefore decide on war for the most trifling reasons, as if it were a kind of pleasure party. 120 Any justification of it that is necessary for the sake of decency he can leave without concern to the diplomatic corps, who are always only too ready with their services. The following remarks must be made in order that we may not fall into the common error of confusing the Republican with the Democratic Constitution. The forms of the state, Civitas 121, may be classified according to either of two principles of division, underscore the difference of the persons who hold the supreme authority in the state, and the manner in which the people are governed by their ruler, whoever he may be. The first is properly called the form of sovereignty, forma imperil, and there can be only three constitutions differing in this respect, where, namely, the supreme authority belongs to only one, to several individuals working together, or to the whole people constituting the civil society. Thus we have autocracy, or the sovereignty of a monarch, aristocracy, or the sovereignty of the nobility, and democracy, or the sovereignty of the people. The second principle of division is the form of government, forma regiminis, and refers to the way in which the state makes use of its supreme power, for the manner of government is based on the Constitution, itself the act of that universal will which transforms a multitude into a nation. In this respect the form of government is either republican or despotic. Republicanism is the political principle of severing the executive power of the government from the legislature. Despotism is that principle in pursuance of which the state arbitrarily puts into effect laws which it has itself made. Consequently it is the administration of the public will, but this is identical with the private will of the ruler. Of these three forms of a state, democracy, in the proper sense of the word, is of necessity despotism, because it establishes an executive power, since all decree regarding and, if need be, against any individual who dissents from them. Therefore the whole people, so called, who carry their measure are really not all, but only a majority, so that here the universal will is in contradiction with itself and with the principle of freedom. Every form of government in fact which is not representative is really no true constitution at all, because a lawgiver may no more be, in one and the same person, the administrator of his own will, than the universal major premise of a syllogism may be, at the same time, the subsumption under itself of the particulars contained in the minor premise. And, although the other two constitutions, autocracy and aristocracy, are always defective in so far as they leave the way open for such a form of government, yet there is at least always a possibility in these cases that they may take the form of a government in accordance with the spirit of a representative system. Thus Frederick the Great used at least to say that he was merely the highest servant of the state. P. 1122 *. The democratic constitution, on the other hand, makes this impossible, because under such a government everyone wishes to be master. We may therefore say that the smaller the staff of the executive, that is to say, the number of rulers, and the more real, on the other hand, their representation of the people, so much the more is the government of the state in accordance with a possible republicanism, and it may hope by gradual reforms to raise itself to that standard. For this reason, it is more difficult under an aristocracy than under a monarchy, while under a democracy it is impossible except by a violent revolution to attain to this, the one perfectly lawful constitution. The kind of government, 123, however, is of infinitely more importance to the people than the kind of constitution, although the greater or less aptitude of a people for this ideal greatly depends upon such external form. The form of government, however, if it is to be in accordance with the idea of right, must embody the representative system in which alone a republican form of administration is possible, and without which it is despotic and violent, be the constitution what it may. None of the ancient so-called republics were aware of this, and they necessarily slipped into absolute despotism, which, of all despotisms, is most endurable under the sovereignty of one individual. Second definitive article of perpetual peace 2. The law of nations shall be founded on a federation of free states. Nations, as states, may be judged like individuals who, living in the natural state of society, that is to say, uncontrolled by external law, injure one another through their very proximity. Every state, for the sake of its own security, may and ought to demand that its neighbor should submit itself to 124 * conditions, similar to those of the civil society, where the right of every individual is guaranteed. This would give rise to a federation of nations which, however, would not have to be a state of nations. That would involve a contradiction. 4. The term state implies the relation of one who rules to those who obey, that is to say, of lawgiver to the subject people, and many nations in one state would constitute only one nation, which contradicts our hypothesis, since here we have to consider the right of one nation against another, in so far as they are so many separate states and are not to be fused into one. The attachment of savages to their lawless liberty, the fact that they would rather be at hopeless variance with one another than submit themselves to a legal authority constituted by themselves, that they therefore prefer their senseless freedom to a reason-governed liberty, is regarded by us with profound contempt as barbarism and uncivilization and the brutal degradation of humanity. So one would think that civilized races, each formed into a state by itself, must come out of such an abandoned condition as soon as they possibly can. On the contrary, however, every state thinks rather that its majesty, the majesty of a people, is an absurd expression, lies just in the very fact that it is subject to no external legal authority. And the glory of the ruler consists in this, that, without his requiring to expose himself to danger, thousands stand at his command ready to let themselves be sacrificed for a matter of no concern to them. 126 * The difference between the savages of Europe and those of America lies chiefly in this, that, while many tribes of the latter have been entirely devoured by their enemies, Europeans know a better way of using the vanquished than by eating them, and they prefer to increase through them the number of their subjects, and so the number of instruments at their command for still more widely spread war. The depravity of human nature 127 shows itself without disguise in the unrestrained relations of nations to each other, while in the law-governed civil state much of this is hidden by the check of government. This being so, it is astonishing that the word right has not yet been entirely banished from the politics of war as pedantic, and that no state has yet ventured to publicly advocate this point of view. For Hugo Grotius, Puffendorf, Vattel and others, Job's comforters, all of them are always quoted in good faith to justify an attack, although their codes, whether couched in philosophical or diplomatic terms, have not nor can have the slightest legal force, because states, as such, are under no common external authority, and there is no instance of a state having ever been moved by argument to desist from its purpose, even when this was backed up by the testimony of such great men. This homage which every state renders, in words at least to the idea of right, proves that, although it may be slumbering, there is, notwithstanding, to be found in man a still higher natural moral capacity by the aid of which he will in time gain the mastery over the evil principle in his nature, the existence of which he is unable to deny. And he hopes the same of others. For otherwise the word right would never be uttered by states who wish to wage war, unless to deride it like the Gallic prince who declared, underscore the privilege which nature gives the strong is that the weak must. The method by which states prosecute their rights can never be by process of law as it is where there is an external tribunal, but only by war. Through this means, however, and its favorable issue, victory, the question of right is never decided. A treaty of peace makes, it may be, an end to the war of the moment, but not to the conditions of war which at any time may afford a new pretext for opening hostilities, and this we cannot exactly condemn as unjust, because under these conditions everyone is his own judge. Notwithstanding, not quite the same rule applies to states according to the law of nations as holds good of individuals in a lawless condition according to the law of nature, namely, that they ought to advance out of this condition. This is so, because, as states, they have already within themselves a legal constitution, and have therefore advanced beyond the stage at which others, in accordance with their ideas of right, can force them to come under a wider legal constitution. Meanwhile, however, reason, from her throne of the supreme law-giving moral power, absolutely condemns war 129 as a morally lawful proceeding, and makes a state of peace, on the other hand, an immediate duty. Without a compact between the nations, however, this state of peace cannot be established or assured. Hence there must be an alliance of a particular kind which we may call a covenant of peace, Fogius Pacificum, which would differ from a treaty of peace, Pactum Pacis, in this respect, that the latter merely puts an end to one war, while the former would seek to put an end to war forever. This alliance does not aim at the gain of any power whatsoever of the state, but merely at the preservation and security of the freedom of the state for itself and of other allied states at the same time. 130*. The latter do not, however, require, for this reason, to submit themselves like individuals in the state of nature to public laws and coercion. The practicability or objective reality of this idea of federation, which is to extend gradually over all states and so lead to perpetual peace, can be shown. For, if fortune ordains that a powerful and enlightened people should form a republic, which by its very nature is inclined to perpetual peace, this would serve as a center of federal union for other states wishing to join, and thus secure conditions of freedom among the states in accordance with the idea of the law of nations. Gradually, through different unions of this kind, the federation will extend further and further. It is quite comprehensible that a people should say, there shall be no war among us, for we shall form ourselves into a state, that is to say, constitute for ourselves a supreme legislative, administrative and judicial power which will settle our disputes peaceably. But if this state says, there shall be no war between me and other states, although I recognize no supreme law-giving power which will secure me my rights and whose rights I will guarantee, then it is not at all clear upon what grounds I could base my confidence in my right, unless it were the substitute for that compact on which civil society is based, namely, free federation, which reason must necessarily connect with the idea of the law of nations, if indeed any meaning is to be left in that concept at all. There is no intelligible meaning in the idea of the law of nations as giving a right to make war, for that must be a right to decide what is just, not in accordance with universal, external laws limiting the freedom of each individual, but by means of one-sided maxims applied by force. We must then understand by this that men of such ways of thinking are quite justly served, when they destroy one another, and thus find perpetual peace in the wide grave which covers all the abominations of acts of violence as well as the authors of such deeds. For states, in their relation to one another, there can be, according to reason, no other way of advancing from that lawless condition which unceasing war implies, than by giving up their savage lawless freedom, just as individual men have done, and yielding to the coercion of public laws. Thus they can form a state of nations, civitas gentium, 1, 2, which will be ever increasing, and would finally embrace all the peoples of the earth. States, however, in accordance with their understanding of the law of nations, by no means desire this, and therefore reject in hypothesis what is correct in thesis. Hence, instead of the positive idea of a world republic, if all is not to be lost, only the negative substitute for it, a federation averting war, maintaining its ground and ever extending over the world, may stop the current of this tendency to war and shrinking from the control of law. But even then there will be a constant danger that this propensity may break out. 131, furor impius intues, from it horridus or cruento. Vigil, 132. Third definitive article of Perpetual Peace 3. The rights of men, as citizens of the world, shall be limited to the conditions of universal hospitality. We are speaking here, as in the previous articles, not of philanthropy, but of right. And in this sphere hospitality signifies the claim of a stranger entering foreign territory to be treated by its owner without hostility. The latter may send him away again, if this can be done without causing his death. But, so long as he conducts himself peaceably, he must not be treated as an enemy. It is not a right to be treated as a guest to which the stranger can lay claim. A special friendly compact on his behalf would be required to make him for a given time an actual inmate, but he has a right of visitation. This right 133. To present themselves to society belongs to all mankind in virtue of our common right of possession on the surface of the earth, on which, as it is a globe, we cannot be infinitely scattered, and must in the end reconcile ourselves to existence side by side. At the same time, originally no one individual had more right than another to live in any one particular spot. Uninhabitable portions of the surface, ocean and desert, split up the human community, but in such a way that ships and camels, the ship of the desert, make it possible for men to come into touch with one another across these unappropriated regions, and to take advantage of our common claim to the face of the earth with a view to a possible intercommunication. The inhospitality of the inhabitants of certain sea coasts, as, for example, the coast of Barbary, in plundering ships in neighboring seas or making slaves of shipwrecked mariners, or the behavior of the Arab Bedouins in the deserts, who think that proximity to nomadic tribes constitutes a right to rob, is thus contrary to the law of nature. This right to hospitality, however, that is to say, the privilege of strangers arriving on foreign soil, does not amount to more than what is implied in a permission to make an attempt at intercourse with the original inhabitants. In this way, far distant territories may enter into peaceful relations with one another. These relations may at last come under the public control of law, and thus the human race may be brought nearer the realization of a cosmopolitan constitution. Let us look now, for the sake of comparison, at the inhospitable behavior of the civilized nations, especially the commercial states of our continent. The injustice which they exhibit on visiting foreign lands and races, this being equivalent in their eyes to conquest, is such as to fill us with horror. America, the Negro countries, the Spice Islands, the Cape, etc., were, on being discovered, looked upon as countries which belonged to nobody, for the native inhabitants were reckoned as nothing. In Hindustan, under the pretext of intending to establish merely commercial depots, the Europeans introduced foreign troops, and, as a result, the different states of Hindustan were stirred up to far-spreading wars. Oppression of the natives followed, famine, insurrection, perfidy, and all the rest of the litany of evils which can afflict mankind. China, and Japan, Nippon, which had made an attempt at receiving guests of this kind, have now taken a prudent step. Only to a single European people, the Dutch, has China given the right of access to her shores, but not of entrance into the country, while Japan has granted both these concessions, but at the same time they exclude the Dutch who enter, as if they were prisoners, from social intercourse with the inhabitants. The worst, or from the standpoint of ethical judgment the best, of all this is that no satisfaction is derived from all this violence, that all these The worst, or from the standpoint of ethical judgment the best, of all this is that no satisfaction is derived from all this violence, that all these trading companies stand on the verge of ruin, that the Sugar Islands, that seat of the most horrible and deliberate slavery, yield no real profit, but only have their use indirectly and for no very praiseworthy object, namely, that of furnishing men to be trained as sailors for the men of war, and thereby contributing to the carrying on of war in Europe. And this has been done by nations who make a great ado about their piety, and who, while they are quite ready to commit injustice, would like, in their orthodoxy, to be considered among the elect. The intercourse, more or less close, which has been everywhere steadily increasing between the nations of the earth, has now extended so enormously that a violation of right in one part of the world is felt all over it. Hence the idea of a cosmopolitan right is no fantastical, high-flown notion of right, but a complement of the unwritten code of law, constitutional as well as international law, necessary for the public rights of mankind in general, and thus for the realization of perpetual peace. For only by endeavoring to fulfill the conditions laid down by this cosmopolitan law can we flatter ourselves that we are gradually approaching that ideal. First supplement concerning the guarantee of perpetual peace. This guarantee is given by no less a power than the great artist Nature, Natura di dalla rerum, in whose mechanical course is clearly exhibited a predetermined design to make harmony spring from human discord, even against the will of man. Now this design, although called fate when looked upon as the compelling force of a cause, the laws of whose operation are unknown to us, is, when considered as the purpose manifested in the course of nature, called Providence, 135. As the deep-lying wisdom of a higher cause, directing itself towards the ultimate practical end of the human race and predetermining the course of things with a view to its realization. This providence we do not, it is true, perceive in the cunning contrivances Kunstanstalten of nature. Nor can we even conclude from the fact of their existence that it is there, but, as in every relation between the form of things and their final cause, we can, and must, supply the thought of a higher wisdom, in order that we may be able to form an idea of the possible existence of these products after the analogy of human works of art Kunsthandlungen. The representation to ourselves of the relation 136 and agreement of these formations of nature to the moral purpose for which they were made and which reason directly prescribes to us, is an idea, it is true, which is in theory superfluous, but in practice it is dogmatic, and its objective reality is well established. 137. Thus we see, for example, with regard to the ideal begriff of perpetual peace, that it is our duty to make use of the mechanism of nature for the realization of that end. Moreover, in a case like this where we are interested merely in the theory and not in the religious question, the use of the word nature is more appropriate than that of providence in view of the limitations of human reason, which, in considering the relation of effects to their causes, must keep within the limits of possible experience. And the term nature is also less presumptuous than the other. To speak of a providence knowable by us would be boldly to put on the wings of Icarus in order to draw near to the mystery of its unfathomable purpose. Before we determine the surety given by nature, more exactly, we must first look at what ultimately makes this guarantee of peace necessary, the circumstances in which nature has carefully placed the actors in her great theatre. In the next place, we shall proceed to consider the manner in which she gives this surety. The provisions she has made are as follow. She has taken care that men can live in all parts of the world. 2. She has scattered them by means of war in all directions, even into the most inhospitable regions, so that these too might be populated. 3. By this very means she has forced them to enter into relations more or less controlled by law. It is surely wonderful that, on the cold wastes round the Arctic Ocean, there is always to be found moss for the reindeer to scrape out from under the snow, the reindeer itself either serving as food or to draw the sledge of the Ostyak or Samoyeds. And salt deserts which would otherwise be left unutilized have the camel, which seems as if created for traveling in such lands. This evidence of design in things, however, is still more clear when we come to know that, besides the fur-clad animals of the shores of the Arctic Ocean, there are seals, walruses and whales whose flesh furnishes food and whose oil fire for the dwellers in these regions. But the providential care of nature excites our wonder above all, when we hear of the driftwood which is carried whence no one knows, to these treeless shores, for without the aid of this material the natives could neither construct their craft, nor weapons, nor huts for shelter. Here too they have so much to do, making war against wild animals, that they live at peace with one another. But what drove them originally into these regions was probably nothing but war. Of animals, used by us as instruments of war, the horse was the first which man learned to tame and domesticate during the period of the peopling of the earth. The elephant belongs to the later period of the luxury of states already established. In the same way, the art of cultivating certain grasses called cereals no longer known to us in their original form, and also the multiplication and improvement, by transplanting and grafting, of the original kinds of fruit in Europe, probably only two species, the crab-apple and wild pear, could only originate under the conditions accompanying established states, where the rights of property are assured. that is to say it would be after man, hitherto existing in lawless liberty, had advanced beyond the occupations of a hunter, 138, a fisherman or a shepherd to the life of a tiller of the soil, when salt and iron were discovered, to become, perhaps, the first articles of commerce between different peoples, were sought far and near. In this way the peoples would be at first brought into peaceful relation with one another, and so come to an understanding and the enjoyment of friendly intercourse, even with their most distant neighbors. Now while nature provided that men could live on all parts of the earth, she also at the same time despotically willed that they should live everywhere on it, although against their own inclination, and even although this imperative did not presuppose an idea of duty which would compel obedience to nature with the force of a moral law. But, to attain this end, she has chosen war. So we see certain peoples, widely separated, whose common descent is made evident by affinity in their languages. Thus, for instance, we find the Samoyeds on the Arctic Ocean, and again a people speaking a similar language on the Altai MTS. 200 miles. Milan 139 off, between whom has pressed in a mounted tribe, warlike in character and of Mongolian origin, which has driven one branch of the race far from the other, into the most inhospitable regions, where their own inclination would certainly not have carried them. 140 in the same way, through the intrusion of the Gothic and Sarmatian tribes, the Finns in the most northerly regions of Europe, whom we call Laplanders, have been separated by as great a distance from the Hungarians, with whose language their own is allied. And what but war can have brought the Esquimaux to the north of America, a race quite distinct from those of that country, and probably European adventurers of prehistoric times? And war too, nature's method of populating the earth, must have driven the Pesherais 141 in South America as far as Patagonia. War itself, however, is in need of no special stimulating cause, but seems engrafted in human nature, and is even regarded as something noble in itself, to which man is inspired by the love of glory apart from motives of self-interest. Hence, among the savages of America as well as those of Europe in the age of chivalry, martial courage is looked upon as of great value itself, not merely when a war is going on, as is reasonable enough, but in order that there should be war, and thus war is often entered upon merely to exhibit this quality. So that an intrinsic dignity is held to attach to war in itself, and even philosophers eulogize it as an ennobling, refining influence on humanity, unmindful of the Greek proverb, war is evil, in so far as it makes more bad people than it takes away. So much, then, of what nature does for her own ends with regard to the human race as members of the animal world. Now comes the question which touches the essential points in this design of a perpetual peace. What does nature do in this respect with reference to the end which man's own reason sets before him as a duty? And consequently, what does she do to further the realization of his moral purpose? How does she guarantee that what man, by the laws of freedom, ought to do and yet fails to do, he will do, without any infringement of his freedom by the compulsion of nature, and that, moreover, this shall be done in accordance with the three forms of public right: constitutional or political law, international law, and cosmopolitan law? When I say of nature that she wills that this or that should take place, I do not mean that she imposes upon us the duty to do it, for only the free, unrestrained, practical reason can do that, but that she does it herself, whether we will or not. Fata valentum ducunt, nolentum trant. L. Even if a people were not compelled through internal discord to submit to the restraint of public laws, war would bring this about, working from without. For, according to the contrivance of nature which we have mentioned, every people finds another tribe in its neighborhood, pressing upon it in such a manner that it is compelled to form itself internally into a state to be able to defend itself as a power should. Now the Republican Constitution is the only one which is perfectly adapted to the rights of man, but it is also the most difficult to establish and still more to maintain. So generally is this recognized that people often say the members of a Republican state would require to be angels. 142, because men, with their self-seeking propensities, are not fit for a constitution of so sublime a form. But now nature comes to the aid of the universal reason, derived will which, much as we honor it, is in practice powerless. And thus she does, by means of these very self-seeking propensities, so that it only depends and so much lies within the power of man on a good organization of the state for their forces to be so pitted against one another, that the one may check the destructive activity of the other or neutralize its effect. And hence, from the standpoint of reason, the result will be the same as if both forces did not exist, and each individual is compelled to be, if not a morally good man, yet at least a good citizen. The problem of the formation of the state, hard as it may sound, is not insoluble, even for a race of devils, granted that they have intelligence. It may be put thus, given a multitude of rational beings who, in a body, require general laws for their own preservation, but each of whom, as an individual, is secretly inclined to exempt himself from this restraint, how are we to order their affairs, and how establish for them a constitution such that, although their private dispositions may be really antagonistic, they may yet so act as a check upon one another, that, in their public relations, the effect is the same as if they had no such evil sentiments? Such a problem must be capable of solution. For it deals, not with the moral reformation of mankind, but only with the mechanism of nature, and the problem is to learn how this mechanism of nature can be applied to men, in order so to regulate the antagonism of conflicting interests in a people that they may even compel one another to submit to compulsory laws, and thus necessarily bring about the state of peace in which laws have force. We can see, in states actually existing, although very imperfectly organized, that, in externals, they already approximate very nearly to what the idea of right prescribes, although the principle of morality is certainly not the cause. A good political constitution, however, is not to be expected as a result of progress in morality, but rather, conversely, the good moral condition of a nation is to be looked for, as one of the first fruits of such a constitution. Hence the mechanism of nature, working through the self-seeking propensities of man, which of course counteract one another in their external effects, may be said be reason as a means of making way for the realization of her own purpose, the empire of right, and, as far as is in the power of the state, to promote and secure in this way internal as well as external peace. We may say, then, that it is the irresistible will of nature that right shall at last get the supremacy. What one here fails to do will be accomplished in the long run, although perhaps with much inconvenience to us. As Boutawek says, if you bend the reed too much, it breaks. He who would do too much does nothing. 2. The idea of international law presupposes the separate existence of a number of neighboring and independent states. And, although such a condition of things is in itself already a state of war, if a federative union of these nations does not prevent the outbreak of hostilities, yet, according to the idea of reason, this is better than that all the states should be merged into one under a power which has gained the ascendancy over its neighbors and gradually become a universal monarchy. The wider the sphere of their jurisdiction, the more laws lose in force. and solus 143 asterisk for despotism, when it has choked the seeds of good, at last sinks into anarchy. Nevertheless, it is the desire of every state, or of its ruler, to attain to a permanent condition of peace in this very way, that is to say, by subjecting the whole world as far as possible to its sway. But nature wills it otherwise. She employs two means to separate nations, and prevent them from intermixing, namely, the differences of language and of religion. 144 asterisk These differences bring with them a tendency to mutual hatred, and furnish pretexts for waging war. But, none the less, with the growth of culture and the gradual advance of men to greater unanimity of principle, they lead to concord in a state of peace which, unlike the despotism we have spoken of, the churchyard of freedom, does not arise from the weakening of all forces, but is brought into being and secured through the equilibrium of these forces in their most active rivalry. 3. As nature wisely separates nations, which the will of each state, sanctioned even by the principles of international law, would gladly unite under its own sway by stratagem or force. In the same way, on the other hand, she unites nations whom the principle of a cosmopolitan right would not have secured against violence and war. And this union she brings about through an appeal to their mutual interests. The commercial spirit cannot coexist with war, and sooner or later it takes possession of every nation. 4. Of all the forces which lie at the command of a state, the power of money is probably the most reliable. Hence states find themselves compelled not, it is true, exactly from motives of morality to further the noble end of peace and to avert war, by means of mediation, wherever it threatens to break out, just as if they had made a permanent league for this purpose. For great alliances with a view to war can, from the nature of things, only very rarely occur, and still more seldom succeed. In this way nature guarantees the coming of perpetual peace, through the natural course of human propensities, not indeed with sufficient certainty to enable us to prophesy the future of this ideal theoretically, but yet clearly enough for practical purposes. And thus this guarantee of nature makes it a duty that we should labor for this end, an end which is no mere chimera. Second supplement: a secret article for perpetual peace. A secret article in negotiations concerning public right is, when looked at objectively or with regard to the meaning of the term, a contradiction. When we view it, however, from the subjective standpoint, with regard to the character and condition of the person who dictates it, we see that it might quite well involve some private consideration, so that he would regard it as hazardous to his dignity to acknowledge such an article as originating from him. The only article of this kind is contained in the following proposition: the opinions of philosophers, with regard to the conditions of the possibility of a public peace, shall be taken into consideration by states armed for war. It seems, however, to be derogatory to the dignity of the legislative authority of a state to which we must of course attribute all wisdom to ask advice from subjects, among whom stand philosophers, about the rules of its behavior to other states. At the same time, it is very advisable that this should be done. Hence the state will silently invite suggestion for this purpose, while at the same time keeping the fact secret. This amounts to saying that the state will allow philosophers to discuss freely and publicly the universal principles governing the conduct of war and establishment of peace. For they will do this of their own accord, if no prohibition is laid upon them. 145 The arrangement between states, on this point, does not require that a special agreement should be made, merely for this purpose. for it is already involved in the obligation imposed by the universal reason of man which gives the moral law. We would not be understood to say that the state must give a preference to the principles of the philosopher, rather than to the opinions of the jurist, the representative of state authority, but only that he should be heard. The latter, who has chosen for a symbol the scales of right and the sword of justice, generally uses that sword not merely to keep off all outside influences from 146 the scales, for, when one pan of the balance will not go down, he throws his sword into it, and then victis. The jurist, not being a moral philosopher, is under the greatest temptation to do this, because it is his business only to apply existing laws and not to investigate whether these are not themselves in need of improvement. And this actually lower function of his profession he looks upon as the nobler, because it is linked to power, as is the case also in both the other faculties, theology and medicine. Philosophy occupies a very low position compared with this combined power, so that it is said, for example, that she is the handmaid of theology. And the same has been said of her position with regard to law and medicine. It is not quite clear, however, whether she bears the torch before these gracious ladies, or carries the train. That kings should philosophize, or philosophers become kings, is not to be expected. But neither is it to be desired, for the possession of power is inevitably fatal to the free exercise of reason. But it is absolutely indispensable for their enlightenment as to the full significance of their vocations, that both kings and sovereign nations, which rule themselves in accordance with laws of equality, should not allow the class of philosophers to disappear, nor forbid the expression of their opinions, but should allow them to speak openly. And since this class of men, by their very nature, are incapable of instigating rebellion or forming unions for purposes of political agitation, they should not be suspected of propagandism. Appendix I on the disagreement between morals and politics with reference to perpetual peace in an objective sense. Morals is a practical science, as the sum of laws exacting unconditional obedience, in accordance with which we ought to act. Now, once we have admitted the authority of this idea of duty, it is evidently inconsistent that we should think of saying that we cannot act thus. For, in this case, the idea of duty falls to the ground of itself ultra posse nemo obligatur. Hence there can be no quarrel between politics, as the practical science of right, and morals, which is also a science of right, but theoretical. That is, theory cannot come into conflict with practice. For, in that case, we would need to understand under the term ethics or morals a universal doctrine of expediency, or, in other words, a theory of precepts which may guide us in choosing the best means for attaining ends calculated for our advantage. This is to deny that a science of morals exists. Politics says, "Be wise as serpents," morals adds the limiting condition, "and guileless as doves." If these precepts cannot stand,